script for. Thank you. This open meeting of the Harbor Shellfish Advisory Board is being conducted remotely, consistent with Governor Baker's executive order of March 12, 2020, due to the current state of emergency in the Commonwealth given the outbreak of the novel coronavirus. The order, which you can find posted on the town's website, allows public bodies to meet entirely remotely so long as reasonable public access is afforded. Ensuring public access does not ensure public participation unless such participation is required by law. This meeting is convening by telephone conference, video conference, via Zoom app, Facebook Live, etc., as posted on the meeting agenda. Please note that this meeting is being recorded and that some attendees are participating by video conference. Accordingly, please be aware that other participants may be able to see you, and that take care not to screen share your computer. Anything that you broadcast may be captured by the recording. All supporting materials that have been provided to members of this body are available on the town's website unless otherwise noted. I, Andrew Lowell, the chair, will introduce each speaker on the agenda. After they conclude their remarks, the chair will go down the line of members, inviting each by name to provide any comment, questions, or motions. Please hold until your name is called. Please remember to mute your phone or computer when you are not speaking. Please remember to speak clearly and in a way that helps generate accurate minutes. For any response, please wait until the chair yields the floor to you. State your name before speaking. If members wish to engage with other members in discussion, please do so through the chair, taking care to identify yourself. After members have spoken, the chair will afford public comment as follows. The chair will first ask members of the public who wish to speak to identify their names and address only. Once the chair has a list of all public commentators, I will call on each by name and afford 3 minutes for any comments. Finally, each vote taken in this meeting will be conducted by a roll call vote. I'll take a roll call attendance. Mr. Brace?
Aye.
Mr. Bossy?
Present.
Ms. Andrews?
Present.
Do we have any other members?
Yeah, you should be able to see him. Mr. Franzuto?
Mr. Franzuto?
Aye.
Mr. Sidlowski?
No.
No. Mr. Pronk?
No.
Okay. Speaking tonight, we'll have Mr. Carlson for Natural Resources.
Good evening.
Yes, thank you. All right, I'd like to call to order this meeting of the Harbor Shellfish Advisory Board, January 18th, 2022. Do we have an approval of tonight's agenda, please?
So moved.
Second, Mr. Chairman, this is Ginger.
Motion's been moved by Mr. Franzuto, seconded by Ms. Andrews. All in favor, Mr. Brace?
Aye.
Mr. Bossy?
Aye.
The chair votes aye. Approval of draft minutes, January 4th, 2022. Has everybody had a chance to take a look at them? Any revisions to be made, please say so now.
Mr. Chairman,
Mr. Bossy?
with Tom Sadlowski and I were listed as absent from the meeting, but we were both present. So we
Okay.
just want to change that.
Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Bossy. Anyone else? If none, I'll harbor a motion for approval.
I'll make that.
Is there a second?
Second.
Mr. Bossy is motion for approval of the draft minutes of January 4th with revisions. Mr. Franzuto seconds. All in favor, Mr. Brace?
Aye.
Ms. Andrews?
Well, since I was so late, I think I should probably abstain.
Okay, that's fine. Chair votes in favor. Thank you. Under the chairman's report this evening, I would like to recognize a longtime waterfront man for a moment of silence for Mr. Dan Kelleher, please. Thank you. Marine Department report. Do we have any representation, Mr. Brace?
We do not.
Natural Resources, Mr. Carlson, please.
I'll actually turn this over to my colleague, Tara Riley.
Thank you.
Hi, good evening. I have a short report tonight. So with all this wind that we've had, we went out on the beaches this morning at low tide, which weren't actually that low, but looking for seed, and we did not see anything, which in some ways is a good thing, but otherwise it's a bad thing because there's not that much seed. One thing that we're looking at in Mattakit with the northwest wind is we're going to look at that large seed population that we located to see if any of it blew into the channel, which is something that Tim Mooney cautioned us about. So I'm supposed to go out this week with Carl. So we'll do some test tows and just kind of see if stuff moved around and how it's looking. Let's see. We're still working on the DMF report related to the moorings. I've had to request some information on the pump out program and to get some numbers from the DMF to add to the report. So we're going to do a internal review this week, and then I will have it for you for the following meeting so that you guys can put, can review it for us and let us know what you think. There's still plenty of time, so I think we're in good shape on that end. And then my colleagues had a few things. I'm just going to look on the sheet real quick. Thais said that she's working on a project in Sacajah Pond where they're placing benthic barriers over nuisance widgeon grass, or their plan is to, and the pond mats will block out light to cover the grass that and cause it to die. And so they're trying mats out first to avoid the use of herbicides. They're placing them on the Quidnet side of the beach where most people are swimming, and they're in the process of developing a rain garden or a bioswale to filter nutrients that are entering the pond and feeding the grass. That will also be on the Quidnet side. Thais is collecting plankton samples in both harbors weekly to get an idea of the plankton communities throughout the year. And we are still currently waiting on our 2021 water quality report from SMAST. As far as coastal resilience goes, the plan was accepted by the select board on January 12th. So now they can start with implementation. They just need to understand the phasing of the projects and where to get the grants from. Community support will be important, and they'll be looking for SHAB support for projects over the next years. And that's kind of all I have for right now. If you guys have any questions, feel free to ask. The hatchery has started back up. We have algae growing in there, and we'll be bringing in our first set of quahogs to condition them for a later spawn.
Thank you, Ms. Riley. Board members, questions?
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Franzuto?
Yeah, Tara, I'll be more than willing to help on that DMF thing about the pump out program. I've been involved with it since 1989, so
Yes.
I can shed some light on that.
Yeah, thank you, Dave. Ironically, I have all of your reports from when you submitted them. So that had the pump out gallons in the boats. I'm just trying to get the ones that from after you transitioned to the other job. And so I wasn't really sure if it'd be quicker to get it from the Marine Department or from the DMF.
Well, I can call Cecil. Cecil French is the guy who
Yeah.
runs that show.
Yeah, that's who I emailed.
I can call Cecil and just tell him to send you a copy.
Okay, that'd be great.
Yep, he's a dear friend, and I'll stun him up.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Thank you, Mr. Franzuto. Any other questions from the board on natural resources report, or specifically for Ms. Riley? Not seeing or hearing any. Thank you. very much.
You're welcome.
And your letter for our last meeting was spot on. I want to thank you for that as well, Ms. Riley. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Moving forward, public comment tonight. Any public comment for Natural Resources Department or Marine Department? Not seeing or hearing any. We'll move forward into old business. Ted Lambrick's oyster lease discussion. This is really, as you all know, sent back from the select board for us to discuss again. I think we're all up to speed on this. I'd like to hear any comments from the board at this time. Anybody like to speak? Mr. Franzuto, please.
Yeah, I was hoping that Jeff Carlson could give us possibly some insight or some options or some discussion points where, I mean, we're here to support the Natural Resources Department, which is what we did. And of course, we have our own opinion and we voiced that also, but Mr. Chairman, if Mr. Carlson could give us a little bit of insight, I'd be more than willing to listen.
Thank you, Mr. Franzuto. Yes, Mr. Carlson, if you would. I was a little confused at the select board meeting when I heard Mr. Lambrick mention he's filled some cages. Can you please clarify that when this was on our agenda for a lengthy amount of time, I was in the understanding that he was not supposed, Mr. Lambrick was not supposed to be filling cages until his old gear was off the bottom and things were approved by your department. Is this correct? Please, Mr. Carlson.
I believe through all of the discussions we had, that was our understanding as well.
Okay. And Mr. Franzuto, something specific from Mr. Carlson, or Mr. Carlson, do you have an overview at this point? I mean, from discussion from the select board meeting, I'm concerned for what Mr. Lambrick has put in for efforts as far as having livestock in the water as we speak and gear as well. If we make the decision tonight to have the same decision as we had before, then I believe there ought to be some type of a plan in place, and I think the rest of the board may feel the same way for what happens to Mr. Lambrick's gear and his livestock. So could you help us out in that area, Mr. Carlson, please?
Sure, I'd be happy to. I know Mr. Brace had his hand up as well. It may be helpful to get
Sorry.
all the
right.
questions out, and then I'll try to address them all at once.
Thank you for that, Mr. Brace.
Yeah, it was along the lines of what Mr. Lowell had just said. You know, we've tracked this process from when it began and have been supportive of all of Mr. Lambrick's efforts and secured an extension for him in the spring of 2021. And following that, he got a few more extensions. And it had, yes, always been my impression that we've been striving to get him to get his boat in the water so he could get the cages out of the water, which have been determined by, I guess, dives by the Natural Resources Department, that the gear was in tough shape on the bottom, that it needed all to come out before he could proceed. We had the knowledge that he had seed to put in there, that he had a certain number of cages on shore, but it's always been my knowledge that he was supposed to get it all out and then we go from there. And at the September 8th select board meeting, it was determined that he had about 30% of his gear out of the water, and that the directive for the 90-day extension was you have it all out of the water and not one single cage in the water by the December 8th meeting, or your license gets revoked. And to learn at, you know, at that meeting, to learn at the January 5th meeting that not only was not all the gear out by the time that he was supposed to be out, but that he was taking the gear and cleaning it off and putting it back in and putting feed in. I was, extremely frustrated that knowing that that's not the way it was supposed to be, according to the Natural Resources Department. And also that we'd taken great pains to make it so that Mr. Lambrick had enough time to do what he had to do. And in fact, he wasn't even really doing what he was supposed to be doing. He was doing whatever he wanted to do. Kind of feel a bit betrayed. So that's what I had to say. And I would say, Mr. Lambrick, I know you're going to hear a lot of stuff that's going to be uncomfortable to hear at tonight's meeting. And I would say, please hold your thoughts until we're ready to hear from you, and let everybody say what they got to say. Okay, Jeff.
Thank you, Mr. Brace. Mr. Franzuto, please.
And Peter's exactly right. And we wouldn't be in this difficult dilemma. Peter was kind to not say this, but we wouldn't be in this dilemma if he hadn't put oysters back in the water. And then the disposition of those oysters, I questioned the other night, is a whole nother subject of what's going to happen to them. And, I liken it to if the selectmen revoked a taxi license for non-compliance and or non-use, they wouldn't be concerned with the taxi operators' taxis and equipment and radios and things like that. They wouldn't have to worry about the disposition of that. They would just revoke the license. So I don't think that there should be consideration for what's going to happen with this equipment, because that's not our concern. Our concern was to get the equipment out and then move forward in a positive manner. So I just wanted to say that, because I don't think we should worry about that. That's not what we asked for. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Franzuto. Any other board members with questions or comments?
Mr. Chairman, hey, Bossy.
Mr. Bossy, please.
Yeah, along the lines of what they said, it really upset me to find new seed going in. I honestly, I feel like we were played, that it was a move to extend and bring us to this point where we have to decide now, well, now there's additional money invested in this. There's additional seed out there. There are cages out there. There's work been done that never should have happened. It wasn't supposed to happen. And so this keeps getting tossed back on this board and the select board to bring it to a conclusion. And it's being intentionally stretched out, and figuring that eventually we'll get to June or July or whenever they start harvesting, these are going to be harvested, and all will be well. But I think it's an intentional move, and I just want to share that.
Very good. Thank you, Mr. Bossy. You've all summed it up very well. Ms. Andrews, anything to add?
Well, I would just, thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is Ms. Andrews. I would just like to add that for month after month, Mr. Lambrick said he just needed one more month, regardless of whether the work was the boat, the gear, or whatever else was part of the operation. And to hear, oh, just one more month after month, with a certain lack of progress, did not really inspire confidence.
Thank you, Ms. Andrews. Mr. Carlson, we'll move on to you if we could.
Sure, I'm happy to provide any information. I think if it's helpful for people, I may just really quick run through the timeline that we have and can kind of put back together, just to remind people of the time spent on this, and kind of the events that have taken place. So, apologies, I'm a little hoarse, but So we initially issued the potential revocation letter in April of 2020, that this process initiated and was started in, um, as part of that letter, and something that we've done as kind of past practice all the way back to dealing with Mr. Murray and other times this comes up. We also tell people to essentially stop work on their lease, because what we fear is that all of a sudden someone decides to change the situation or kind of create the situation that we're in now, where work has occurred outside of the scope of the process. It muddies the water a bit, to be perfectly honest. So, in kind of our bookkeeping from there, we issued that letter out towards the end of April. I believe the actual date was April the 20th. We were able to document and able to confirm after that deposit went down on oyster seed right around June 8th or June 9th from ARC for seed after the cease and desist had been put forward. And we can provide that documentation to you folks if you'd like to see it. And then we initiated kind of the hearing process with you guys in late 2020, kind of in September, as we remember, and then into 2021, that went forward with some milestones for, the boat being back in the water. And I think it was our original intent, like we've discussed, to get that gear in the water that we all saw and we saw was pretty firmly rooted to the bottom and in disrepair and kind of grown into the bottom in spots and definitely not in the working order that we expect through our leases for sitting for that period of greater than 3 years that the regulations call for. So we moved through there, and then we entered. You guys were supportive of our recommendation to the select board to revoke those licenses. It went to the select board where further extensions were granted. The boat was able to get in and some of that work was being cleaned up. It's kind of come to light now that Mr. Lambrick took possession of that seed that he purchased in June of 2020 and put that back in the water with his cages as he cleaned them, and then kind of reported the progress that we were there. In that time period too, I know there's, differing of opinion of it. The warden, in consultation with the DMF, did confiscate gear a couple times. I know we talked about that at great length at the select board hearing, so I won't, get into great detail over that. And that kind of leads us to today, where there are oysters in the water that were purchased after the stop work had gone on. And that leads us to where we are. I mean, I think our recommendation is still that, the requirement for working the lease 1 out of every 3 years was not met. The remedy to that and the regulations is revocation. I think we feel like ample time was given and has now been, extended even more so and muddied a little bit. But I think we still feel that, given what led us to this originally, plus the time given and other issues, that we're still, recommending revocation of the licenses for your guys' support, and then ultimately for hopefully the select board to continue onward with. So I'm happy to take questions. I also really quickly, sorry, one last thing that came up at the select board meeting that I wanted to touch on. I know there was some talk about being rid of the oysters that are currently on site, especially some of the older oysters, and going through ARC. I was able to speak through the Division of Marine Fisheries and Gabriel Lundgren just even today to talk about it even at greater length for that program. So essentially, it is not a Division of Marine Fisheries program. Is Mr. Lambrick would be selling oysters to ARC as a wholesaler. They have a wholesale permit. So if they wanted to take those and purchase those and sell them again or process them as part of a program that they may be a part of, that's certainly up to them. But that's essentially a market transaction and not a direct state program. There was some monies involved through some state grants to help out growers during the pandemic. But I believe that after talking to him today, I think most of that money has been exhausted already to help those guys out. And I know that was a good program and helped a number of people, but it would essentially be, from our understanding, a transaction where Mr. Lambrick would have to directly transfer those oysters to ARC in his possession at all times until they took possession of those. So that came up at the select board meeting, and that's kind of the information we have. I'm happy to answer any questions about that or more about that discussion if people have them, and actually happy to take any questions or concerns that you guys have.
Thank you, Mr. Carlson. Board members, any more questions? Mr. Bossy, please.
Jeff, I think one of the things I came away from this select board meeting was that they kicked this back to us, hoping maybe to get a plan for what would happen to the equipment that's down there in the event that we again recommend revocation. Has Marine Department, has your department, Natural Resources, done anything or come up with any kind of ideas that we could talk about?
Sure. So some of the standard conditions that go through the lease and the use of bottom guidelines and things that are there, there's two provisions as part of that that are kind of germane to this conversation. One is setting a time period once the lease is revoked for removal of gear. And the lease actually specifically calls out that if gear is ordered removed and is not done so within the time frame, it's within the rights of the leasee, which in this case would be the town, to then hire a third party to remove that gear, and they're eligible to pass that bill along to the previous leasee. So we do have remedies in that time way. I think setting the time limit is something that would be important to that. But other than that, the actual lease and agreement for use of the property already includes a provision that very clearly spells out what's to happen if gear is abandoned or not able to be retrieved, what remedies the town has.
Could I have a follow-up question? Is there a time frame that would allow at this point someone else to come in for the coming season? Is there a window that would close if this was delayed?
I may actually defer a little bit to Tara. She's a little bit more knowledgeable on the permitting process. If I get this wrong, I don't believe that if someone were to take possession, obviously there would have to be a public hearing and obviously a period of time to get it to somebody. I don't believe that someone would be able to get all of the permits in place. They might be able to get some gear in the water by the end of the season if all permitting went well.
Okay.
But I think he would probably be looking at the spring to summer of 2023 to reasonably start up an operation kind of from scratch and get it in. And then you'd be looking obviously a couple years after that for your first harvestable oyster. But I think hopefully anyone that gets into, the business understands that there's a delay between when you're going to start with animals in the water to harvestable size, depending upon, what seed class you're able to get and how big they are when you get them and how they grow. But usually permitting for this, you're probably looking at, especially for as slow as permits are going right now, probably a 6-month minimum if you were lucky, because
Okay.
everyone's just moving slow.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bossy. Mr. Franzuto, please.
And Jeff, correct me if I'm wrong. That would also apply if he were to sell or transfer the license. That person, whoever it may be, the next person on the list or whatever, would have to still go through all those permitting processes, right?
So transferring is a little bit different, right? So if you transfer the license, you can amend your existing license as part of that transfer with the Corps. It's a much faster process than starting from scratch to do. And that can happen much quicker. And, transfers are something that are allowed by regulation. So it is an option to Mr. Lambrick that he could, transfer his license to somebody else. And, they essentially buy the business as it is. So they would be inheriting, the cages, whatever the terms of the transfer that they worked out were, whether they needed to remove gear. That's obviously something that does go through a hearing process at the select board, since you're changing license holders with the town. But we've seen that happen before, and amending a core permit or something to reflect that transfer is a substantially faster process than
Right.
starting from scratch.
Okay. But how does, just one more quick question. How does that affect, or does it affect your waiting list? In other words, could he transfer that license to Dave Bossy? And Dave Bossy's not on the waiting list. Could he transfer it to Dave Bossy and it would be an more expeditious process?
So you can transfer it to another essentially eligible entity. So either a company or a person
Okay.
that you can transfer to pending the select board hearing is the way it's currently set up by regulation to happen.
Okay.
Just as an example, this board was a part of it when Gordon transferred his leases a few years ago to McLean Wraith.
Right.
That was something where they applied to the town and said, I'm essentially selling my business as is to Mac. They went to the select board. The select board essentially rolled everything over just
Okay.
in place, and Mac was able to amend those permits and is up and running and is successfully producing oysters. So
Okay.
it can happen, but it's independent of the waiting list. And it's really what gives those guys, I'll try to put this in my best Dave Franzuto terms. So what allows those guys to retire and have a business to sell to someone to get that final retirement piece that a lot of these guys might be looking for towards the end.
So basically the waiting list is for new acreage or acreage that gets revoked.
Yes, sir.
Okay, thank you. Sorry to take so long.
No, that's all right.
Thank you, Mr. Franzuto. Mr. Brace, please.
Yes, and so taking a leap off of what Mr. Franzuto just said, along with Mr. Carlson at the select board meeting on January 5th, Mr. Lambrick mentioned a guy who he said lived pretty close to him who might be able to take it over for him. Mr. Lambrecht also said, although I would say never do this again, never admit your age, admitted that he was older and that he had maybe a couple more years left in him. And it just made me think, well, why not find a way to transfer it? Why go through all this just for a couple more years? I understand that it's hard work, but it seems like a solution might be presenting itself here. So anyway.
Thank you, Mr. Brace. Mr. Carlson, is there anything in the works, or what are the chances of more acreage being opened up in the future, or near future, or not so near future?
Sure. So I did forget a step in the transfer process, and I apologize for this. We don't do it very often. The other thing they have to do, obviously, is qualify through the requirements of the town. One of the things we do vet is, a production plan that comes through. So if there's going to be a major change in production or gear type, or any of those things, they do have to provide that as part of the transfer, as part of the public hearing process. So if they're going to, use the oyster grows, they need to provide that they're still going to be using the oyster grows, and or if they're switching, they're going to be switching to whatever. And that also impacts their amending of their permit with the Corps and potentially their propagation permit with the state. So wanted to make sure that added step was in there, that production/business plan to be discussed. As far as new acreage goes, it's a little bit of a tricky subject, right? For new acreage. I think one of the difficult parts with new acreage is Nantucket, despite some of the talk that we hear from time to time, to qualify sites for aquaculture, you really have to have no shellfish or no eelgrass in an area to even potentially qualify. Nantucket still is fortunate enough to have pretty substantial amounts of both shellfish and eelgrass and spots. So to find an area that's, of an acreage worth production that doesn't have those requirements is very difficult. I think there are other potential areas, but to go through that qualifying process, we would probably internally survey those areas first and identify if our department feels that they're worthwhile pursuing. Then the select board has to request the Division of Marine Fisheries to go through its formal evaluation process on those sites. They come down and physically inspect by diving those areas. They do shellfish surveys. If they come up with the less than one shellfish per meter and don't have eelgrass, then those areas can qualify, and then you can start through the process. So it's it's a difficult process. I know when we did the head of the harbor expansion and added on, kind of the area in double. I mean, that was almost a 2-year process from start to finish to get them out here and get that done. And then the overwintering sites up in the head of the harbor Cascada area. And then one of the spots in Pulpus was kind of the same for, getting them out here in that same time period. So it's difficult to do. I know we have a lot of calls that come in for areas like Mattakit. And Mattakit is tough because the habitat out there is still available. And, we still find shellfish in a lot of that area. So I guess for the good, we don't qualify a lot of areas. If you're an aquaculturist, having limited space is probably not the best. But I think just personally having natural habitat and natural shellfish stocks available, I think is a real benefit to the island as a whole. So that's the tough part is there's probably not new areas coming forward in the immediate future.
Thank you, Mr. Carlson. Any other board members have comments, questions, anything on this subject at all? Mr. Sidlowski has not joined us tonight. I'd like to simply remind part of our previous process when we first voted to send this recommendation to the select board. There was one dissenting vote, Mr. Sidlowski, and I'd just like to clarify that his reason for dissension was not that he was against the revocation, but that he was actually against the extension of time that we had granted Mr. Lambrick. And Mr. Sidlowski wanted to see the revocation take place immediately, and we gave a certain amount of days extension before doing so. So I just wanted to clarify that. And this has been a lengthy process, and I'm sorry in a way that it has ended up back to us, but here we are, so I won't elaborate on that. And I now will allow Mr. Lambrick a moment to speak if he wishes.
Thank you. By no means do I have any or had any intention of disrespecting anybody. I've put in my effort as best as I possibly could, given the circumstances, and there's nothing more I can do other than that. The seed itself, I did mention at the select board meeting in June that the seed was going in, and I did mention that it was in the September meeting, and there was no objections at that point in time. So I'm not exactly sure. I never was under the impression that I couldn't. I'm pulling up cages with oysters in them, so I've got to do something with them. Either destroy them or you try to sell them. It seems to me a shame to just kill them, get rid of them. You know what I mean? So my plan to get rid of them was to wait till the VBRIO season was over and sell them to these processors who shuck them and freeze them and stuff like that. And there was, just state contacted me. I don't know if it's a state or who it is. The people who are in aquaculture contacted me last year and made the offer of being able to take some. Last year would have been much better. Had I been allowed to work the gear last year, it all would have been out by the end of the summer. No problem a year ago, a long time ago. But that's water under the bridge at this point. So I don't disrespect any of you folks or your position or anything else. I pulled the cages up. The seat that went back in was all in new gear. It was floating there in trays. It wasn't in reworked gear. Some of the seed now is in reworked gear. Some of it's in new gear. But a lot of the gear that's back down again, it's just holding the old oysters. I mean, I have bushels and bushels and bushels of these big oysters that I'm trying to get to the mainland. And of course, Jeff I spoke with Lundgren today as well, and I asked him to send an email to their office verifying that I spoke with him a couple of weeks ago about transporting these and the process and make sure it was well within the bounds of everything anybody wanted. I don't want to get outside of the bounds of the law by any means. I never intended. I do have a Sean Fitzgibbon. I've been working with him for a while. He wants to take over the lease. That's a good thing. It would be much better, I think, to have him take it over and transfer it in a period of time. We've been working out the details as best we could at this point. Sean has been attempting to contact Jeff for the last week or so. I don't know if he got through or not, or if Jeff responded to him. I don't know anything on that end of it. So there's options. Like I say, since actually more than 2 years now, when I changed over the process to go and do this in the first place, I paid where I put the applications in and put the check in for the leases and everything else. And I got the notice from Jeff, which I didn't get until June or so. I mean, it was sent, return receipt requested, and he has the receipt on that, so he knows. The day I got it, I called him. He said, it shouldn't be a huge problem. Give us a letter of intent. I sent that to him. I have the letter of intent here. Everything was sent, return receipt and all that stuff. So all that information's there. I sent that to him. The response was, don't touch the gear. Now that set me in a tailspin, because now what am I going to do? I've got 2 guys hired for the summer. And what am I going to do? Well, maybe just do boat repairs for now until we get this thing settled, because it looked like the process was going to be I could go to the meetings. The early part of the summer, it didn't happen until the fall. So we lost the whole summer's time. So I took the boat apart. It took me a lot longer to put it back together than I expected. And not disrespecting, I was hopeful in the time period to get it done. But there's a lot of stuff. It was hugely involved process. I mean, I've got over 100 feet of stainless steel pipe running through that thing, and all kinds of hydraulic systems, everything. And it's set up specifically for doing this oyster thing. That's it. And that's as much as I could say about the darn boat thing. It didn't help it in October that I blew out my shoulder, and then eventually had to go and have surgery on it. I put it off as long as I could, but I was unable to use my right arm, so I wasn't getting much done there. I'd hired help at the time, so they were helpful, but they're not quite adept at getting the stuff done that I wanted to get done. The process has been a pain in the tail for you and me both. I've put up with the weather, everything. Now in the fall, October came. We had 2 really good weeks. Well, Tara was there when I got towed out because the engine broke down. It took him 2 weeks to get it back in the water. Jeff was there the day we put the boat back in. I had a conversation with him right there on the beach. He said, I heard you've been pulling a lot of gear out. I said, yeah, we've been well at it. And we were really going at it, and we were really doing fine. But that kind of stymied things. A couple other breakdowns, and we got them all these problems are solved. You know, I can deal with the breakdowns. I can deal with the weather. It's just hard dealing with the red tape. The end result is I've been talking to Sean for over a year now, and he's willing to take it over. He's willing to work at it, work with me this summer and all that stuff. But we'll see. I don't know. You know, I certainly don't mean any disrespect for anybody involved here. I mean, I respect the process and everything else. I respect the authority. I definitely, there's just no way. And I apologize if you feel that way. I don't know what more I can say.
Thank you, Mr. Lambrick. You've said plenty, and you come well understood and heard. I'm truly sorry for the position that you're in. I'm familiar with young Mr. Fitzgibbon, and hopeful that something can work out that your investment can stay in the water. Mr. Carlson, any leads on moving in that direction that we could add to our recommendation, or thoughts?
Sure, I was just going to confirm that Sean did reach out, and he did reach out via email last week. I apologize for not getting back to him. I was unexpectedly out of the office for last week for some COVID issues that I was having. So I just getting caught up to emails from last week now. So there's a host of people trying to get back to that aquaculture and not aquaculture. And Sean is definitely on that list. He had some questions about transferring. Obviously, like we talked about, if transferring is an option, a production and business plan from Mr. Fitzgibbon and how we're going to do it and making sure that it's going to be actively worked, is kind of critical to anything moving forward. I think, not to beat a dead horse, we're here because the lease was left fallow for, greater than 3 years of time. And that's, something that we take seriously in making sure that, gear is left in compliance. And, one of the things that we're tasked with is making sure that we're trying to uphold the rules for everybody that's growing. And, it's not a 1-to-1 and how we interpret it and for how it is. For us, it's making sure that whether it's, Ted Lambrick or Steve Bender or Chuck Connors or Simon Edwards or Matt Herr or Mac Wraith, that the rules are the same rules for everybody, and that, we treat them all the same way. And it's one of the reasons why, when we initiate a revocation process, we do it the same way every time. And we, the same letter with the same language that says stop, because we don't want to create more complications to a situation until, there's a path that we've worked with the Harbor and Shellfish Advisory Board or the Select Board and the grower to either get to a path to resolution or a path to revocation or whatever the path goes. So we try to do it the same. We don't like to be in the situation that we're in. None of us do. We appreciate all the time that everyone spends on it. We appreciate the time that, Ted has spent on it. It's not something that we're looking to do or do it, but we're trying to make sure that everyone understands that when you are in agreement with the town through a lease, that there are rules that are expected to be followed. And when they're not followed, that there's a process that's initiated to remedy that one way or the other. And we feel that we've followed that process pretty well. There's always room for improvement in any, but we feel that, we've provided good information and provided the justification for our reports to you guys. And I'll just kind of leave it at that.
Thank you, Mr. Carlson. Mr. Brace, please.
Yes, I just want to say something about the perception of disrespect. I don't think there's anyone on this call that thinks that, Ted, you intentionally disrespected us. It's just that, us operating with the information from Mr. Carlson that you removed the cages from the water, period, that was all that was to happen, and that other stuff happened aside from that it was a sort of a disregard for what we recommended you do, we asked you to do, and what Mr. Carlson asked you to do, and you just went ahead and did it. And whether you told us at the June meeting and the September meeting that you did that stuff, it doesn't matter. From the way I read all this, and from attending almost all the meetings, you were supposed to take the gear out to bring your lease into compliance, and you did some of that, but then you did some other stuff that I'm gathering from Mr. Carlson you weren't supposed to do. And so that makes us feel like, well, why did we waste our time, helping this guy out and getting him an extension and seeing him through the winter and trying to check up on him and see what was going on with his boat, and giving you the huge benefit of the doubt. So it's more of a perception and not an actual, because I know you're not that type of person. It's just that you know, the cages were supposed to come out, and that's what was supposed to bring you into compliance, but you did some other things that, whether you told us about them or not, you weren't supposed to do according to the Natural Resources Department. So that's why you're getting the reaction from us in that way. At least that's how I feel.
Thank you, Mr. Brace. Board members, any other comments or questions? Not seeing or hearing any at this point. Not to carry this on any further, I feel, you know, not a whole lot has changed since the last time we've sent the recommendation. And if any board members have a motion in mind to make, would you like to continue to or resend our original recommendation to revoke the license? Board member may do so.
Mr. Chairman,
Mr. Bond,
I'd like to resend the original motion with an addition of a time frame to, I'm going to say a 90-day time frame. And to remove the grown oysters that are there, the marketable oysters that exist, any equipment, transfer whatever, but revoke on a given date, and with a 90-day period to after which point it's done. Nothing go further. Everything can come out, nothing else going in. But it's basically a cleanup period. And
is there a second to Mr. Bossy's motion?
I would second for discussion.
Yes.
And I think we need to be clear on how much time it's going to take to do the transfer, and if maybe 90 days isn't long enough. And I would seek clarification from Mr. Carlson. Do we revoke his lease and then the transfer happens, or does he hold on to the lease and then he just transfers it? Because it's his lease, he's just passing it to somebody. So does it need to get revoked in order for him to stop doing whatever he's doing and then transfer it, or can he, as a businessman, transfer his business to this person? I just want to make sure that that okay, we've decided, it's sounding like at least two people want to do this, but that there's enough time to do it. Because if we put 90 days on it and that's not enough time, then we're back to having another meeting and making another recommendation. I'd rather have the time, allot the time that's needed if this is what we want to do. So I would defer to Mr. Carlson.
Thank you, Mr. Brace. Mr. Carlson?
Sure. So just for a point of clarity, if the leases and the licenses are revoked, there's nothing to transfer. So they have to stay in place to be transferred. I think if you guys were going to set a time frame for, cleanup or transfer, I think you could set a time frame to say that, you have X amount of days to either complete a transfer or, vacate the lease. I think with that transfer, though, I think you would also want that, pending review of that, whoever it's going, review with the board of their production plan and their business plan that we review to make sure that it's sound and there's timeframes in place that are acceptable to the board. And then hopefully acceptable to the select board, just as an example, if Ted was transferring to Mr. Franzuto, that he would come in and say, my plan is to have all of the old gear removed by April 1st. And then, this season, I'm going to be putting in 10 new cages and X amount of seed that I'm able to get. And this is my plan. And then I think for that transfer for that first year, especially given that, I think you would want to have some sort of regular check-in to make sure that that plan is being enacted in accordance with the plan. And if it's not, what remedies are in place, or if there's something that situationally happens, like a bull failure, or if they're not able to get seed because the hatchery they had purchased it from has issues, that you can adapt and make whole that model. But I think it should be interactive through that process with wherever it goes till we can be sure that we're back in compliance. I think one thing that may be interesting with that too may also be, kind of some milestones to unlock the full acreage that's currently held under the leases. So right now it's the 2 4-acre leases. Maybe we start with, clean up and, half of it. And then after successful working of the one portion, the other portion becomes eligible again. But I think those are details that we could work out as far as, a production and business plan with whoever the transferee may be. If that's the route that everyone wants to go and seems acceptable, or a time frame for just absolute removal, or the town removes it at the current leaseholder's expense, I think is the other choice.
Wow, that's a mouthful. Thank you, Mr. Carlson. Mr. Bossy?
I would defer to Mr. Franzuto, but since you called on me, I'll just say, right, so it was only one of those two options in my motion, was that either that there was a revocation, equipment would either be pulled on a time frame or transferred on a time frame. Those were my only two options, just so we're all clear that that's because Jeff went on, and then I kept having to remind myself that we're talking about whoever takes over, the new person. So if there was to be a transfer, so it's one of those two options.
Well, Mr. Bossy, it sounds to me like the motion would have to be worded with the transfer first, and then have a time frame involved with the transfer. And if that's not met, then a revocation would come into place. That would be the only way revocation or transfer could be in the same motion. Would that be correct, Mr. Carlson? Just a second, Dave.
Well, if we said 90 days for one or the other, if the transfer happens, the select member, this is a recommendation to the select board.
Yes.
As we know, the select board could very well come back after 90 days and say, oh, we do have a presentation for a transfer that we believe will go through, so we will extend it until this transfer. I would say that's not something we have to worry about. We certainly can. It concerns me less because the select board will do what the select board will do. And if they feel they have something in hand that's going to work on a transfer, I'm pretty sure the select board will do what they need to do to affect that transfer, regardless of our time frame. So I would go with the same time frame for both, one or the other, either cleaned out or satisfy the select board that's being transferred. Dave,
Mr. Chairman.
I'll pass it off.
Just a second. Did Mr. Franzuto have his hand up as well? I'll get to you,
Yes.
Mr. Andrews. Yes.
Yes, he had his hand up.
All right. Mr. Franzuto, please.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, thank you. Jeff, is the Lambrick lease 8 acres?
It's 2 4-acre pieces. They're 2 separate ones.
2 separate ones. Okay, then. Then I think that whatever gets transferred, if we agree to do a transfer with Mr. Bossy's time frame, and that moves forward with an approved production business plan, that only 4 acres would be transferred. And then if the milestones are met, now, well, let me ask another question. I'm sorry, I'm working this on the fly here. What's the smallest lease that you have in production now?
So the Cascade ahead of the harbor sites are all 2-acre sites, right? So everyone maxes out at, you can't have more than 10 acres. So a lot of these guys have had 4, 4, and 2 through separate leases over time. I think the way to deal with it, I think we're dealing with a little bit of 2 separate issues here. And to try to separate them to keep them easy. I think whatever comes forward as far as a, production plan and milestones, if someone transfers or takes, I think you would have to transfer the leases right in their entirety. And I think that that's a separate issue, right? So you transfer the acreage over. I think when you had an agreement with the new leasee, I think that's where you could essentially create like a quasi probationary period for them to use all of it. But I think that's separate from what we're dealing with today. I think that's part 2, because I think that's what I got into in Mr. Bossy's thing. And I think I was getting the cart before the horse a little bit in dealing with it. I think for Mr. Bossy's immediate motion, and I'm certainly open to discussion, and Dave, your feedback's always appreciated because you've been doing this a lot longer than me, is a motion where you would set a time period to transfer the license or, vacate all gear and potentially like forfeit the license or have it revoked. I think that's the motion that Mr. Bossy is looking for.
Okay, that makes good sense. Just one other question, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to hear what the board thinks about. Do we, if we move forward with a transfer that's acceptable, and if that doesn't work, a revocation, do we want to limit ourselves to this, whatever his name is, Fitzgibbons person? Or do we want to open it up that any acceptable applicant?
Mr. Brace.
I think that since Mr. Lambrick has a relationship with this person and has been working on this for a year, I mean, is there a town law that says he has to do that, or can he just transfer it to who he wants to? If he had children he wanted to, he could do that, I assume. But he has this person who knows what's going on. Seems like it's the easiest thing to do. Is Mr. Franzu, Dave, through you, Mr. Chairman, Dave, are you thinking that we open this up to the people on the waiting list? Is that what you're saying? Or
no, I'm playing devil's advocate here. Let's just say I had $100,000 and I read this in the newspaper that the Board of Selectmen, or that the Harbor Shellfish Advisory Board recommended a transfer, and if the transfer wasn't successful within a certain period of time, that the revocation would happen. And I have $100,000, and I call Lambrick tomorrow afternoon and say, I'll give you $100,000 for this. Hypothetical. I'm just asking. I mean, I think that to your point, Peter, and it's really a good point. He's been working with this guy, and this guy's interested, and we all know how hard it is to work on the water. So maybe this is definitely the best way to go. I'm just asking.
Mr. Carlson, please.
Yeah, I think as far as transfers go, and again, some of this is going to be personal opinion on it. I think the beauty of the transfer process is that if you have a business that is marketable and saleable, as long as the individual you're transferring it to can meet the qualifications and provide the documentation to, meet the standards, I think it's up to the person whose business is there to get the best opportunity for themselves to get away from it. And, if someone wants to overpay for it, good on you for getting that deal. And as long as they qualify, I think that would be up to Mr. Lambert.
Well, you know what? That's a great clarification. That makes it a lot clearer in my mind. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman?
Ms. Andrews, yes, please.
Yeah, I appreciate Mr. Carlson's clarification also. I think it's kind of wasteful to sit on our high horse and say, well, we decided it should be revoked, so we're revoking it. So I would favor a transfer if it can be achieved. And I'd like to ask Mr. Carlson how long a transfer might typically take to determine that it's a suitable candidate. I don't think an arbitrary 90 days is necessarily practical if there's work that needs to be performed in the harbor in the middle of winter. So I just would like some guidance on a practical but efficient timeline.
Thank you, Ms. Andrews. Mr. Carlson?
Sure. So I'll try my best again here. I mean, obviously this time of year is, probably ideal to start, talking about a transfer. I mean, we're into the slower season. It's not the production part of the year for these guys. So, I mean, a lot of it depends upon, the effort and quality of the materials that whoever is taking over the lease, puts together for how expedient that review could be. It does require a public hearing with the Board of Selectmen. So, or excuse me, with the Select Board. So you're looking at, a couple weeks to advertise it and then the hearing to go through. So, I mean, realistically, if someone submitted a production plan that was up to snuff tomorrow, right, from our review, it would go to you guys first for your review and comment. I mean, the Select Board could certainly schedule their public hearing prior to that. But I think you're looking at least, I mean, realistically speaking, probably kind of a 60-day, minimum to kind of get in front of everybody and meet advertising requirements. And obviously whoever's inheriting this lease too, right? Part of the production plan is also going to have to include some level of plan and time frame to deal with any remaining gear that's not desirable to be in the water, or gear that's stuck to the bottom or that's not in good repair. So some level of cleanup would be required as part of that too. So I think that's there. Obviously, if someone's going to transfer it, they have to have all of the proper insurances in place to take receipt of it too. So that would take some time. I can't speak for how long it takes to generate that insurance. I can't imagine it's too long if you have a pretty good understanding of what you have. Probably a couple phone calls and a week would probably get you there. The long part is always the advertising and public hearing. So, I think if there's someone there, or enough time for Mr. Lambrick to sort out if there are multiple parties that are interested. I mean, I think realistically to have it in front of the board in 90 days is probably more than enough time, but I would fear that anything less than 45 or 60 would be a really tight time frame to get onto a select board agenda. If it was just to get the plan filed, you could probably do it by then. But I think we also want to be sure that we're getting a plan that's, of good quality and addresses the concerns, and they have time to get information and get resources together as well. So, I mean, on the fly to kind of come up with that time frame, that's about what my thought is. But haven't had to put a time frame like that together on the fly before, so I always reserve the right to make corrections. But I think that's probably pretty close.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Carlson. Board members, my concern here is to have this sorted out as best as we can with the Mr. Bossy. I like your approach with this with your motion, excuse me. But I think we need to revise it a bit. I believe we should give the best recommendation we can to the select board. It's up to them for a final decision. We are not a regulatory board, but I believe our best decision on this and the best motion to move forward with should be crafted here. I don't want to suggest that we may need more time for it. I think we can do it this evening, leaving some wiggle room for natural resources to add in any logistics that we may miss. But our message here is, I think the transfer is a good way to go. Whether we split up acreage or not, that sounds like it should be part of this as well. This was not mentioned at the select board meeting, I don't believe. And so if something tooled into this about the acreage can be suggested as well. And then, of course, a time frame, and if the time frame's not met, then revocation if necessary. So Mr. Franzuto. Unmute, Mr. Franzuto.
Yeah, sorry.
Thank you.
I'm struggling with my my throat. Anyway, as Mr. Chairman, as you just alluded to, there's some moving parts and pieces here. And I think that to get it right, it would be incumbent upon, well, Mr. Lambrick and his potential buyer to, if that's the way we're going to move forward, to sit down with the natural resources director and shellfish biologist and outline these exact bullet points that Jeff was talking about. The production plan, the financial plan, the insurance, the monthly check-in, the milestones of if this gets transferred and you've met those milestones, then the entire 8 acres would be available. If you haven't met the milestones and you now feel that based on your finances and your production and availability of seed and the boat and all the moving parts, that 4 acres would be relinquished. As Jeff said, that would be something that you could deal with the new leaseor, whatever, and that should be dealt with then. So if whoever it is not making sufficient progress, we don't get caught up in this 2-3 year delay in getting those 4 acres into someone else's hands. What does the board think about that? Because for us to sit here and try and craft these different bullets for contingency of the transfer, I think it would be better done by Mr. Carlson and his staff with Lambrick and the new person. Let him come up with those. I just did a quick timeline. If you did 100 days, excuse me, if you did 120 days, that would give us 20 days to work, to review whatever Jeff brought back. And that would give the person, or it would give the process 100 days to do all this. And that would take you to May 1. So what is the feeling of you, Mr. Chairman, and the board? What do you think about that idea?
Mr.
This
Bossy,
is all before contract.
yeah. Mr. Bossy, you had your hand up as well.
Thank you. Yes, I think Dave's got an interesting idea. I'm really concerned that we're just reading too much into this. That Mr. Carlson said earlier that whoever takes over the lease, that's a separate problem. And it really is. Someone has to come in and prove to the select board that they're capable of doing this, and they have the means and wherewithal to accomplish this. And I don't think that's something that we really need to be involved in. Quite frankly, I think Dave's idea that has to happen. Somebody has to sit down, make the list, make the potential person taking over aware of what's required of them. But in our case, I again, and I'm not stuck on this, but I just believe we either that our recommendation shouldn't be how they deal with that new lease. We've been asked to deal with the current lease. The current lease is 8 acres. We're looking for a solution. We're looking for a way to make it get cleared out if we recommend revocation again. And that's why I tried to keep it simple in that we hope for a transfer, but in 90 days, if it's not transferred, or obviously, as I said, the select board could always extend that. The 90 days is just something we're recommending. And besides, I'd also like to point out that it's not 90 days from today. It's 90 days from when the select board has their public meeting on this and votes for a revocation. So it's more like 100 and some days right now. But my personal opinion is to keep it simple and not deal with the new potential lessee, but to deal with this lease in place now. But again, I'm not stuck on that.
Well,
Mr.
Mr.
Chairman?
Bossy, thank you. You actually have summed that up very well. Ms. Andrews?
Given the discussion, I'd be willing to second Mr. Bossy's motion.
Okay, I believe we had a second for the discussion, Mr.
Oh,
Brace.
okay.
But that's okay.
Oh, okay.
Um,
Sorry. Thank you.
I'm just wondering if Mr. Bossy's motion is proper enough to work, because it did start with the revocation and then move into the transfer, and if we should rescind that motion and bring it back around worded properly, and also with suggestion that Mr. Carlson put out the order of events versus us putting out the order of events. It really has to come from the regulatory authority. He needs to make that suggestion to the select board, I believe. So, Mr. Bossy, did you want to?
Right.
Please?
I would be willing to reverse it as you suggested. I think that's a good suggestion, that we're looking for a transfer. And if that process is not in place within 90 days, then revocation will occur.
Okay, well, just a second. Officially announce, please, Mr. Bossy, that you're going to rescind your first
Correct. Right.
motion, and then Mr. Brace has to rescind his second as well. I
Oh,
believe.
okay. Thank you. Yes, I'll rescind my motion, my original motion.
Okay, I
Okay.
rescind my original second.
Okay, and now we'll begin again with a clean slate. If unless there's more discussion from the board, I will entertain a motion again from Mr. Bossy. Any discussion before Mr. Bossy? Mr. Bossy, please.
I'd like to make a motion then to begin a revocation. I'm sorry. I'd like to make a motion that a transfer of this lease occur, and that the process starts within 90 days. And if that process has not begun to the satisfaction of the select board, that revocation takes place at 90 days.
Thank you, Mr. Bossy. Do we have a second to that motion?
I'll second that, Mr. Chairman. This is Ginger.
Thank you, Ms. Andrews. Discussion on the motion, Mr. Franzuto, if any?
Yes, Dave, I thought I thought you were gonna say that transfer and it had to be completed within 90 days.
No, if through the chair, I'd like to respond to that. No,
Yes, please.
originally that was my thought, and I've learned that can't happen. Probably it could, the way life works, it could happen. If all goes well, it will happen. But if the select board has a process in place where someone's come and presented to them that they're applying to do this, because the select board may say, we need more information next month, come back, doing their due diligence. So as long as the select board is satisfied that this process is in place for this transfer to occur, I'm satisfied.
Okay, okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bossy. Any more discussion on the motion? Everybody understand the motion? Motion's been made by Mr. Bossy to request the select board move forward with transfer of Mr. Lambrick's license to another oyster
Mr.
fisherman.
Chairman?
Ms. Andrews.
It's Mr. Lambrick who has to do the transfer, so that I think what we're asking is that the select board allow Mr. Lambrick 90 days to work on this transfer process. I'm not sure if that's the exact wording. Perhaps Mr. Carlson has a clarification. I don't know.
That does sound correct, Mr. Bossy.
Correct. It's that the process is in place for this transfer to be taking place to the satisfaction of the select board.
All right.
So if at the end of 90 days, if nothing's happened, nobody's come before them to speak, I would expect them to revoke the lease. If someone's come before them with a presentation that didn't fulfill all of their needs and satisfy them, and they ask them to come back with more complete information, then I believe it's up to the select board to say, to permit more time, which is why I left it open, saying that the process has been started to the satisfaction of the select board.
Mr. Brace, please.
And to clarify, Mr. Bossy, what you mean the process has been satisfied, what you mean is that we're recommending the 90 days start with when the selectmen say, okay, go do this, correct? It doesn't start now.
No, it starts, it can't, right, it wouldn't start until the select board elects it to start, right, which would be next time they meet, hopefully. Right.
And maybe and so we implying with this motion that Mr. Carlson will write up all the milestones and the particulars that will have to be followed, or is that separate because that's the transfer? So we're just saying we want this to happen within 90 days, but it's separate from the actual transfer process, because there is an actual transfer process, and Jeff will be able to refer to that to write that up. I just want to make sure that everything's covered.
That's my intent, because that Ms. Carlson will be at that select board meeting and will present the requirements, because I would assume they will ask, what's the requirement for transferring this to someone? And he would present that as he did to us tonight.
Mr. Carlson. Thank you, Mr. Bossy and Mr. Brace.
I think if it's helpful, because I know the select board remanded this back to you guys for a recommendation. I think it may help the process along if the motion was simply to recommend to the Board of Selectmen to put a 90-day requirement on initiating the transfer process, or if that hasn't been achieved, that revocation is to automatically happen. And then that way, that's your suggestion to them. And then they're obviously going to want to know what's involved with that. Or the motion could be, move to require that the transfer process in consultation with the Natural Resources Department be underway within 90 days or the licenses are revoked. maybe, because they're looking for a recommendation from you guys. They'll get it from us whether they want it or not. That's what our task is. So just making sure that their recommendation is coming from Shab.
Thank you, Mr. Carlson. Mr. Bossy?
I'd just like to say that I believe the first one that Mr. Carlson mentioned that did not include natural resources specifically was my intent by the motion, that the process must begin, and I believe it must begin to the satisfaction of the select board. Again, the select board makes the decisions, the ultimate decisions. And so that's why my motion said, if they're satisfied that there is a process going on to transfer this, so be it. Because even if it was natural resources that was not satisfied, select board's still going to look at it and go, well, we're kind of satisfied. So let's just, that's why I just want to keep it as simple as possible, and tell them how SHAP feels. We believe it. We'd like to see it transferred, but if not, it should be revoked. And that's the time frame, was 90 days.
Thank you, Mr. Bossy. Mr. Brace, for lack of having I just want to make sure you're able to interpret this properly in our letter of recommendation. There's been a lengthy discussion, and it's actually a lengthy motion, which I really can't even repeat. So unless Mr. Bossy repeats it again, but we do have a motion in. Mr. Carlson did make a suggestion of revising it a bit, which I think we could do or not. I think we're getting our point across. Mr. Brace, I just want to make sure that you'll be able to go back through the minutes and get this and the recording and get this written properly for us as secretary.
Well, I'm sure that if I don't, I can ask Mr. Posse or Mr. Carlson, but the way I hear it is that we're recommending that that the select board approve a transfer that has 90 days to happen. And if it doesn't happen within the 90 days, then the revocation takes place. Am I correct?
Mr. Bossy?
A transfer, you were correct, except approving the transfer within 90 days. I want the select board within 90 days to have agreed that there's a process in place that they foresee that this will occur. See, that's what I'm saying. If we just give the 90 days, then the select board will make it 6 months, because they don't know who won't attend that night. A meeting will get canceled because of weather or something. So it will inevitably get delayed. So instead of 3 months, it will be 90. And what I'd like to say is within 90 days, the select board is satisfied that there's a process in place. Or at the end of that 90 days, if there is not, automatic revocation. Well, not automatic, it's just a revocation occurs.
Okay, so what you're saying is the select board has 90 days to initiate that process. And then once they've initiated it, they can put on however long a time period for the transfer to happen.
That's essentially correct, right? I don't see them initiating the process per se. It will be presented to them as, we'd like to do this. We'd like to have this transfer. So they wouldn't initiate it, but so I wouldn't use that word. But yes, the rest of it is absolutely correct, that they would then set their own time frame for when that gets completed.
Mr. Chairman? Oh, sorry.
I'm sorry, Ginger, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Oh, I would just, Mr. Chairman?
Yes, Ms. Andrews, please.
Yeah, I would say that because it is Mr. Lambrick who does the transferring, it's his business. That our recommendation to the select board is that we allow Mr. Lambrick 90 days to transfer his business or face revocation. That could be our recommendation.
Does that cover it in a simpler form, Mr. Bossy?
It is a simpler form, and it certainly was my original intent. And my only difference between that, which is where I started really, except in my mind, And where I ended up was that if we get somebody who's qualified and the opportunity exists for this just to keep going without having to start from scratch, we shouldn't be drawing an arbitrary 90-day. In fact, we won't. The select board will extend it, I can guarantee you. So we could say 90 days right now. But if they have a process in place, why would they kill it at the end of 90 days simply because some I wasn't dotted or T crossed? They won't, they'll extend it. So I would just, that was my fine point with the process in place.
So, Mr. Chairman?
Yes, Ms. Andrews?
Yeah, I think Mr. Bossy, the way he wanted to phrase it was that Mr. Lambrick had 90 days to start the process of transferring, and that would have to be, if I understood Mr. Carlson, excuse me, Mr. Carlson, that part of that is that the person to whom it is being transferred has to meet with the Natural Resources Department, et cetera, and then they ask for our recommendation. So that Mr. Lambrick has 90 days to start the process of transfer, and if not,
Mr. Chairman,
All right, just a second. Ms. Andrews, go ahead, Mr. Franzuto, please.
if we just insert the word application has to be made within 90 days. But you don't need Mr. Lambrick's name in there. It's just application. Dave Bossy's motion with application has to be made within 90 days, or that puts it in the selectmen's hands. They can run with it at that point, give extensions if need be. So application has to be made for transfer within 90 days, or the permit or the license is revoked.
I just have a follow-up question on that,
Mr.
if I may. So if an application is made for a transfer, does that then go directly, is this select board, it immediately becomes up on their agenda? Is that the case?
Yeah.
I just want to make sure that they know that the process, that they're then controlling the process in terms of timeframes.
Jeff, is the application made to Natural Resources, or is the application made to the Board of Selectmen?
It would ultimately be made to the Board of Selectmen because they're the awarding authority, but it would require our review to get there.
Sure. Okay, then I like that wording then, that application must be made within 90 days to the select board, which it will be.
Right.
And if not, revocation occurs.
There we go.
Okay, can we amend the motion to that without rescinding the motion and the second, Mr. Brace?
I think to amend his motion, we would have to take a vote.
Okay. All right, and Mr. Carlson, you had suggested amending a bit as well. Are we covering what we need to cover, or are we leaving anything out that would make it more difficult for you to streamline this process? Mr. Carlson, please.
No, I believe the motion that you guys have just discussed is probably the easiest way.
Thank you, Mr. Carlson. So to add in the word application as suggested by Mr. Franzuto, would you like to do that, Mr. Bossy, to amend your motion?
Yes, I would amend my motion to say that the application for transfer must be made within 90 days to the select board. And if not, then revocation takes place at the end of those 90 days.
Mr. Brace, did you second that motion to begin with?
No, it was Ginger.
Ms. Andrews, do you?
I would second that motion. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Any more discussion? Not seeing or hearing any, I'll take a roll call vote. All in favor of Mr. Bossy's motion as amended, that Mr. Brace will have recorded properly. It's seconded by Ms. Andrews. All in favor, Mr. Brace?
Aye.
Mr. Franzuto?
Aye.
The chair votes aye as well. Thank you. I'd like to move forward in old business. On the agenda is excessive sand and scallops and dredging plan. Mr. Carlson, we've kept this on here.
Mr. Chairman,
Yes, Mr. Brace.
before we move on, I just want to thank Ted for attending the meeting and working through this with us. I know it was a painful process for you. And we appreciate you showing up and explaining yourself. And I also want to thank Mr. Carlson for all his knowledge. So thank you.
Mr. Brace,
That's it.
thank you. Thank you for that. Speaking for the board, I appreciate that. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, I'm sorry. I had a hard stop. I had a hard stop 10 minutes ago. I'm going to have to drop.
Okay.
I'm sorry.
1, 2, 3. We'll still have a quorum?
I believe you
Yes.
will. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Bossy.
Thank you.
Thanks, Dave.
So, Mr. Carlson, while you're here, I'd just like to ask quickly, has there been any progress on a dredging plan? And
Wait, Andy,
yes.
I'm sorry. Mr. Lambrick had his hand up.
All right, Mr. Lambrick, please.
I just wanted to thank you all for the patience you've had with all this and waiting through it. It's a process. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Lambrick. Moving forward, if we may, Mr. Carlson, please. Any progress on a dredging plan at this point?
Sure, just really briefly. So one of the action items from the Coast Resiliency Plan is to do a sediment transport study and create a dredge plan from that. So the funding for that is being proposed as part of next year's capital budget. So hopefully that'll be moving forward starting in July.
Okay, well, that's good to hear. So Vince Murphy is involved in this as well?
Yeah, Vince and I are kind of tag teaming this in our office.
Wow, okay, that is wonderful to hear. Thank you very much, Mr. Carlson. Any comments, questions from the board on the dredging plan? Not seeing or hearing any. Health of the
Mr.
harbor?
Chairman, just Mr.
All right.
Chairman, just as soon as you get something for us to look at, we'd love to look at it, Jeff.
Thank you, Mr.
Absolutely.
Mayor.
I think once the final scope is developed and we get ready to put it out for procurement, be happy to share that in advance.
Thank you very much. Anybody else? Dredging plan. Health of the harbors, excessive lawn fertilizer use, update, discussion, new information. Anything having to do with fertilizer, I will allow in this discussion. We also have it in new business as far as the ban articles go. But if anybody has anything they'd like to discuss under health of the harbors, we may. I know it's been a long meeting, so I did get one citizen concerned today about the new park at the Rotary and the landscaping and hydro seeding that's taken place there. I know it's a wonderful park. He was concerned about what the land bank in particular may be using for fertilizer. It's a large area of beautiful green grass at the moment. I haven't looked at topography and how much out in front of the building area where grades head downhill towards the creeks, but certainly a topic of interest.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes, well, Mr. Carlson had his hand up.
Oh, sorry. I defer to Mr. Carlson.
Thank you.
I would say the easiest path to all of that, Andy, would probably be to invite probably Rachel Freeman
Mhm.
to a meeting to talk
Yeah.
about what the management of that park is planning on being, or whoever she designates. She's one of their property environmental planners there.
Yes. Okay. Thank you, Mr. Carlson. Ms. Andrews,
Mr.
and I'll
Chairman?
get to Mr.
Yeah.
Franzuto next.
I had asked the same question and I can't remember who now answered it shortly after the park opened, but as I understand it, the grass is a placeholder while the native vegetation gets a grip, so to speak.
Okay. Good to know. Mr. Franzuto?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I talked to Andrew Vorse and he had been in contact with the health director, and if the articles have done anything, it's rekindled their concern about the fertilizer. And we were basically told that because of COVID, they hadn't done much on it, but we were assured by the health department that with the newfound concerns, they're going to be because it is in their regulations, Board of Health regulations, and I did finally get a copy. Dave Bossy gave me a copy, and then I went online. But anyway, if anything, there's been some new interest in that, so I don't think it's going to die. I think the fertilizer regulations will be looked at for compliance, et cetera, rather sooner than later.
Thank you, Mr. Franzuto. Anybody else? Board members? Not seeing or hearing any. Thank you, Mr. Carlson. I will reach out to Ms. Freeman. FDA shellfish taking prohibition in mooring fields. Ms. Riley mentioned that there's some progress taking place there, I believe, in your letter at our last meeting. Yes, Ms. Riley.
Yeah, the letter is being formulated. We just need to recirculate it internally before I hand it out. I just want to make sure we're being thorough with everything.
Thank you. Board members, questions, comments? Not seeing or hearing any discussion for water quality testing? Any updates from Natural Resources on any water quality testing or comments from the board? Nothing.
I guess we're waiting for SMAS for this year's report, so that'll be the next thing for us to look at.
Thank you. Mr. Carlson? No? Okay. Moving forward into new business, fertilizer ban articles discussion. Was not able to attend the FinCom. I believe Mr. Brace spoke on our behalf. Is there anything you could update us on with how the FinCom, how did they handle this at their meeting?
Well, I wanted to, anyway, I guess this comment would be directed at Miss Riley. And maybe she could, speak to the sponsor of the article. We were at that hearing. There were numerous people that got up and spoke. There were a lot of people there at that meeting to speak in support of this article. There were people there to oppose the article, but there were a lot of reputable people like Bobby DaCosta wanting to speak on the article. Emily Molden as well. And, maybe Joe is watching this meeting, but, the FinCom asked him point blank, well, what studies do you have? How can you say that fertilizer is going into our harbors and causing algae blooms? And Joe had nothing. And I don't mean to throw him under the bus or call him out, but he's sponsoring this article. and he has to have a study that he can point to. He has to be able to say Yes, the Estuaries Project, done by SMAST. There's a report for Nantucket Harbor and Natticut Harbor and Hummock Pond and Sackatchew Pond. He's the guy that's doing this, and whether he wants to portray himself as as Joe Blow on the water or a hatchery employee or however he's portraying himself, since he's the one that's putting this up. I'm sorry, I just feel really strongly about this. It's so important. He has to have reports that he's going to point to. He's going to be able to say, well, yes, Madam Chairwoman, the nitrogen going into salt water causes the algae blooms. The phosphorus going into the fresh water causes the algae blooms in fresh water. And he has to know what TMDLs are. And I'm sorry, but all he said was, well, I don't really have anything. I don't have any reports. I thought that was, I felt bad for him. He was ill prepared and needs to be better prepared, because if this thing keeps going, then he's going to have to get up and speak, and he can't depend on other people getting up and speaking on his behalf. And that's basically what happened. The people who support this article, other than Joe, got up and said, well, this is why. And Thais was there, and she made some comments. And Thais said that she would send the finance committee articles, research that would support the assertions that Mr. Manella was making. But we all know, all of us in this meeting know what happens. We all know that we have sandy soils, and water flushes the fertilizer down to the soils, and it goes into the harbor. And Bobby DeCosta said, we got the most of the algae is on the side of the harbor where all the houses are. There's hardly any algae over there on Co 2, and the algae is in front of the houses in Natticut. So, but the FinCom was like, okay, that's great, but give us the research that tells us this. We want to know this. We need to connect the dots before we can say, yes, this is a good thing. Yes, we give you a positive recommendation. And I've thought of maybe coming to the hatchery and talking to Joe myself, but maybe he's gonna, I don't know how he would take that. Maybe he would take it better from you, Tara, because you know this stuff and he works with you and you're his boss. And I know he's saying that he's not mentioning that he works for the hatchery. A certain number of people know that he does, but he should know what he was talking about. He really should. He really should go up there and be able to quote 3 studies right off the bat and be able to point people there. And so that's all right. I'll shut up.
Mr. Brace, point taken and much appreciative, because I believe, and I can speak for the whole board, that this board is very concerned about fertilizer and its effect on the harbor. And this article, I believe, is very important to us. It certainly is to me. And I know exactly what it's like to be there. I've explained things so many times, and I feel like everybody should already know. But it's amazing how many people do not acknowledge methods and pathways that are bringing fertilizer into the harbor, storm drains from as far away as we spoke about at several meetings, as Mr. Franzuto said, as far away as the high school, as far away as Woodbury Barnabas Lane, and everything in between, and even further than that. There are 5 outfall pipes into the harbor. I've recently talked to somebody who's been in town all his life, didn't even realize there are 5 outfall pipes into the harbor, and that storm drain water is directed directly into the harbor from these storm drains, unfiltered, up from Pleasant Street, Orange Street, Fair Street, Pine Street, all of downtown, all drains directly into the harbor. And it's amazing to me how many people do not understand this. And if we want to see some momentum behind an article like this, then I guess more education is certainly needed, and a good presentation backed up by some facts for Joe would be wonderful for Mr. Manella. So anything that can be done there through your department Ms. Riley would be very appreciated as well. I'm certainly more than happy to share my contact information with Mr. Manella and speak with him as well. Mr. Franzuto, you have your hand up.
Yeah,
Let me,
just,
hold on.
All right,
I
Mr.
want
Brace.
to jump over Dave just for a second.
Okay.
Sorry, Dave.
no
Through
problem.
you, Mr. Chairman. I didn't get the sense that Joe didn't feel comfortable talking in public. He was absolutely fine. He does the Tech Talk Tuesdays. He's used to it. He just needs to have the information.
Yeah.
And Thais and Emily and Bobby DaCosta more than backed him up and provided the information. And I get the sense that the FinCom was receptive to hearing it, and that some people on the FinCom knew what he was talking about. They were almost, goading him into getting the information. Give us this information. So, because they didn't make a decision at that meeting, they'll have another hearing to talk about it. And when they have that hearing, Joe should be able to go back there and talk with authority on it. He should be able to convince them, because he's the one that, and he has to say, he can't say Ligbia, he has to say Lingbia. He has to know what he's talking about. And I just felt, anyway, I'm going to get worked up. So
Okay, Mr. Brace, thank you very much. Next was Mr. Franzuto, please.
Just that aside, the storm drain mapping and maps is not a dead issue. I've actually worked on it today. So I'm still waiting for the GIS guy and the sewer people to provide that to me, but I will have that for the board. So when you said storm drains, I just remembered that's not a dead issue. I'm gonna have that so the whole board can review those discharges. And there's a heck of a lot more than 5 discharges into the harbor, but anyway. The storm drain issue isn't dead.
That would be very good information to add to anything related to harbor health. So I'm sure that would be good for Mr. Manella as well. Thank you, Mr. Franzuto. Anybody else? Discussion on fertilizer.
Mr. Chairman,
Yes, please, Ms. Andrews.
thank you very much for stating succinctly and passionately for the board. I totally agree.
Thank you. That's wonderful, Ginger. Thank you. Tara, Jeff, anything you wanted to add? That's okay.
All set from my end.
All right. Tara, no.
Yeah, I mean, I was not at the FinCom meeting, and Joe is sponsoring the article as a personal citizen. Certainly, we can provide the facts that he needs to support whatever. That's fine. I think, all of us could probably be better prepared for any meeting that we go to. And then, I wouldn't consider us all complete experts on every subject. So, whenever I need help at a meeting, I ask Jeff to attend, or I ask somebody else to attend. And I think that was probably the intention that Joe had with Thais and having the backup for that too. It's a learning experience anytime you're sponsoring an article. And I think he's very, very green and very new with this sort of thing. And, there's a learning curve involved. So, hopefully we can, encourage him to prep better for the next one.
Thank you, Ms. Riley. Well said. Anybody else?
I just have to tell you that Peter has chastised me many times for not having more patience with younger people.
Thanks, Mr. Franzuto. Unless there's something else from the board on this fertilizer ban articles, we'll move forward. I put this on the agenda. I think everybody got Chris Fuller's video showing Lingbia algae in the harbor. As Mr. Brace mentioned earlier, mostly being found on the south shore of the harbor, being the developed side of the harbor. Has everybody had a chance to take a look at the video? It's a short one, short and sweet. Kind of sad to see how there are areas with this algae kind of balling up and really doing a number on smothering eelgrass. Where this has been such a lengthy meeting, we will continue this into our next meeting because I'd like to have more discussion about it and what it is related to, if possible. But if anybody like to say anything shortly now, now's the time to do so. Not seeing or hearing anything. Coastal Resilience Advisory Board, do we have an update, Mr. Brace?
Well, I think pretty much Miss Riley gave that update in her report. Now that the select board has adopted it, pretty much all of our meetings are going to be facilitating the projects as they come along, finding funding, working with Vincent. I think we're going to do quarterly reports to the select board, doing the near term projects now. So I guess it's the work that has to happen now.
Thank you, Mr. Brace. Anybody else on coastal resiliency? Not seeing or hearing any. Are there any public questions or comment tonight? If so, anybody in the public wants to speak, now's the chance to do so. I'm not seeing any hands. Mr. Brace, can you clarify that for me?
So far, nobody requesting to speak.
Okay. Any recap items for our next meeting? Our next meetings are February 1st and February 15th. If there's nothing else to discuss this evening, I'll entertain a motion to adjourn.
Mr. Chairman, this is Ginger.
Yes, Ms.
Second.
Andrews. All right, so we had Mr. Brace move to adjourn the meeting. Ms. Andrews second. All in favor, Mr. Franzuto?
Aye.
The chair votes aye as well. Thank you, Mr. Carlson, Ms. Riley, tonight for your extended period of
Thank you,
attendance
guys.
here.
Jeff,
Thanks to you guys.
Jess, if you have a second, could you give me a call tomorrow?
Yeah, sure thing.
I just got one quick thing I'd like to ask you a question about.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thanks for your help tonight.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Good night, everybody.